The cherry blossoms were falling across Tokyo in the spring of 1945, but for the children of Japan's most powerful wartime leaders, this would be no ordinary season of renewal. As American bombers darkened the skies above the Imperial Palace and surrender became inevitable, these young heirs to a fallen empire faced a terrifying question. What happens when your father's name becomes synonymous with war crimes? Some would flee in the dead of night, carrying nothing but false papers and desperate hopes. Others would watch helplessly as their mothers made impossible choices to protect them from the vengeance of a defeated nation. A few would vanish entirely, their fates lost to history's shadows. Today, we uncover the untold stories of these forgotten children, the sons and daughters of generals, ministers, and architects of Imperial Japan's darkest chapter. Their journeys through occupation, exile, and reinvention reveal a side of World War II's aftermath that history books rarely tell. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the country didn't just lose a war, it lost its entire worldview. For decades, Japanese children had been taught that their emperor was divine, their military invincible, and their cause righteous. But for a select group of children, this collapse carried an additional burden. Their fathers had been the architects of this shattered dream. Consider the children of General Hideki Tojo, Japan's wartime prime minister, and the man who would become the face of Japanese militarism at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. As Allied forces occupied Japan, the Tojo household became a prison of fear and uncertainty. His 7 children suddenly found themselves bearing one of the most notorious names in Japanese history. The eldest son, Hadatake Tojo, was 24 when his father attempted to take his own life, rather than face capture by American forces. The young man watched as military police surrounded their family home, as neighbors who once bowed respectfully now whispered behind closed doors, as his younger siblings asked questions he couldn't answer. How do you explain to a child that their grandfather, who taught them to fish and told them bedtime stories, had been branded a war criminal? But the Tojo children were not alone in their ordeal. Across Tokyo and throughout Japan, the families of war leaders faced similar reckonings. The children of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, struggled with a different kind of burden. Unlike Tojo, Yamamoto had died heroically in 1943 when his aircraft was shot down by American fighters. His children inherited the complex legacy of a man viewed as both a brilliant naval strategist and the architect of America's entry into the war. The Yamamoto children faced a peculiar form of limbo. Their father was dead, so there would be no war crimes trial, no public humiliation, no imprisonment. Yet his role in planning Pearl Harbor made their family name forever linked to the attack that had awakened the American giant. Young Tadamichi Yamamoto, barely 16 at war's end, found himself defending a father he barely remembered to classmates who blamed all of Japan's suffering on the military leaders who had led them into an unwinnable conflict. The psychological toll on these children was immense. Many developed what we might now recognize as symptoms of inherited trauma, the burden of guilt for actions they never committed, performed by men they were still learning to understand as something other than simply father or grandfather. The daughter of Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka faced perhaps the cruelest irony of all. Matsuoka had negotiated the tripartite pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, binding Japan to the Axis powers. He had also been instrumental in Japan's withdrawal from the League of Nations, yet he died in 1946 before he could be tried for war crimes, leaving his daughter to navigate the occupation period, carrying the name of a man many blame for Japan's international isolation. These children lived in a strange, suspended reality. During the early occupation years, they attended schools where new textbooks painted their fathers as villains, where American-sponsored films showed the horrors of Japanese military actions across Asia, where democracy and peace were presented as foreign concepts that Japan had rejected under their parents' leadership. But perhaps most difficult was the silence at home. Many of these children later recalled that their families simply stopped talking about the war years, about their fathers' roles, about what any of it meant. The weight of unspoken history settled over their households like a heavy blanket, suffocating normal family conversations and creating a generation of children who learned to carry secrets they didn't fully understand. What happened next would determine not just their personal fates, but how Japan itself would come to terms with its wartime past. Some families would choose to disappear entirely, while others would embark on remarkable journeys of reinvention, that would take them to the furthest corners of the globe. As the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal began its proceedings in 1946, panic gripped the families of Japan's wartime leadership. Unlike the Nuremberg trials in Germany, which focused primarily on Nazi Party officials, the Tokyo Tribunal cast a wider net, potentially implicating thousands of military officers, government officials, and business leaders who had participated in Japan's 15-year war across Asia. For the children of these leaders, this period marked the beginning of what many would later describe as their lost years, a time when normal childhood simply ceased to exist. The family of General Kenji Doihara, known as the Lawrence of Manchuria for his intelligence operations in China, made perhaps the most dramatic choice of all. Rather than wait for the inevitable arrest and trial of their patriarch, they simply vanished. One day they were living in their comfortable Tokyo residence. The next, neighbors found an empty house with no forwarding address. Years later, investigators would piece together fragments of their escape route. The Doihara children, 3 sons and 2 daughters ranging in age from 8 to 19, had been moved through a network of sympathetic former military officers who helped them reach remote farming communities in northern Honshu. There, with new names and fabricated family histories, they attempted to disappear into rural anonymity. But hiding wartime leaders' children in 1940s Japan proved nearly impossible. The occupation authorities had implemented comprehensive registration systems, schools required detailed family histories, and communities were small enough that strangers attracted immediate attention. The youngest Doihara daughter, Kimiko, was discovered working in a textile factory under an assumed name when a former neighbor recognized her distinctive birthmark. The revelation led authorities to the rest of the family, scattered across 3 prefectures, all living under false identities. But by then, their father had already been executed as a war criminal, leaving the children orphaned in a legal sense, even though their mother remained alive. The psychological impact of this forced fragmentation would haunt the family for decades. Other families chose different forms of exile. The children of Colonel Kingaro Hashimoto, one of the architects of the Marco Polo Bridge incident that triggered full-scale war with China, were sent to relatives in Manchuria just before the Soviet invasion. When the Red Army swept through Japanese settlements in August 1945, these children found themselves trapped in a collapsing colony, surrounded by hostile Chinese and Korean populations who had suffered under Japanese rule. The journey home for the Hashimoto children became an epic of survival that lasted nearly 2 years. 12-year-old Takeshi Hashimoto later described walking hundreds of miles through war-torn Manchuria, dodging Soviet patrols, Chinese nationalist forces, and communist guerrillas, all while hiding his family identity from refugees who might have turned them over to hostile authorities. They survived by pretending to be the children of ordinary settlers, but this deception required them to abandon not just their real names, but their entire sense of who they were. Young Takeshi practiced introducing himself with his false name thousands of times, terrified that a moment's hesitation might reveal their true identity and doom the entire group. When they finally reached Japan in late 1947, they discovered that their father had died in prison while awaiting trial. The children, who had spent 2 years dreaming of reunion, found themselves returning to a country that no longer had a place for them. Their family home had been confiscated. Their relatives were either dead or had disowned the family name, and they possessed no documents proving their Japanese citizenship. The occupation authorities faced an unprecedented challenge: what to do with children who were technically Japanese citizens but had no legal existence in post-war Japan. Some, like the Hashimoto children, spent months in temporary camps alongside other displaced persons, caught between bureaucracies that couldn't quite figure out how to classify them. Meanwhile, other families of war leaders were making even more extreme choices. The children of several naval officers involved in planning kamikaze attacks found themselves aboard ships bound for South America, part of a shadowy network that helped war criminals' families escape to countries with no extradition treaties with Japan. But perhaps the most heartbreaking cases were the children who were simply abandoned. As the war crimes trials intensified, and more Japanese leaders faced execution or lengthy prison sentences, some families made the devastating decision that their children would be safer without any connection to their biological parents. The daughter of a Kempitai officer who had overseen prisoner of war camps found herself deposited at a Buddhist temple with nothing but a note asking the monks to raise her as their own. She would spend the next 15 years believing herself to be an orphaned war refugee, only discovering her true identity when applying for a passport as an adult. These stories of exile and disappearance reveal the human cost of Japan's wartime leadership crisis. While the Tokyo Tribunal focused on assigning legal guilt to individual leaders, the practical consequences rippled out to touch hundreds of innocent children who had played no role in their father's decisions. Yet even as these families scattered to the winds, some would find unexpected paths to redemption and renewal in the most unlikely places. In one of history's most remarkable ironies, some children of Japanese war leaders would find their salvation in the very country their fathers had fought against. The United States, even while prosecuting Japanese war criminals with unprecedented thoroughness, would also become home to several of their children, often through circumstances so extraordinary they seem almost fictional. The story of Masahiko Amakasu illustrates this paradox perfectly. His father, Masahiko Amakasu Sr., had been a notorious military police officer who had orchestrated the assassination of socialist activists and later became a key figure in Manchukuo, Japan's puppet state in China. When the war ended, the elder Amakasu took his own life rather than face capture, leaving behind a son who carried one of the most hated names in East Asian politics. Young Masahiko might have expected to spend his life hiding from this legacy. Instead, he found himself in San Francisco by 1952, enrolled at the University of California under a student exchange program that few knew existed. The program had been quietly established by American occupation officials who believed that educating the children of former enemies might be the key to preventing future wars. The younger Amakasu thrived in American academia, but his journey there had been anything but simple. American intelligence officers had approached his mother in 1950 with an extraordinary proposition. They would arrange for her son's education in the United States, complete with a new identity and financial support, in exchange for detailed information about his father's activities in Manchuria and connections to other Japanese intelligence networks. This placed the teenager in an impossible position. Accepting meant betraying his father's memory and collaborating with the occupying forces. Refusing meant condemning himself to a lifetime of poverty and suspicion in Japan. He chose America, but the psychological cost would haunt him for decades. Other children of war leaders found themselves in America through even stranger circumstances. The daughter of Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier fleet that attacked Pearl Harbor, arrived in Los Angeles in 1953 as the bride of an American serviceman who had no idea of her family background. She had met Technical Sergeant James Morrison at a USO dance in Tokyo, where she was working as a translator for the occupation forces. Their courtship had been conducted entirely in English, allowing her to reinvent herself completely. She became Mary instead of Mariko, created a fictional family history involving parents who had died in the Tokyo firebombing, and successfully immigrated to America as a war bride. For nearly a decade, she lived a perfect American suburban life in California, hosting neighborhood barbecues and attending PTA meetings, all while carrying the secret that her father had been one of the architects of Pearl Harbor. The deception began to unravel only when a Japanese documentary crew visited Los Angeles in 1963, researching the fate of war leaders' families, and a neighbor who had seen the interview recognized her from old photographs. The revelation destroyed her marriage and led to years of legal battles over whether she had committed immigration fraud by concealing her identity. But it also revealed the extraordinary lengths to which these children had gone to escape their inherited guilt and build new lives. Perhaps most remarkably, some American officials had actively facilitated these reinventions. Declassified documents from the 1990s revealed that the CIA had recruited several children of Japanese war leaders as intelligence assets, believing their unique backgrounds and language skills made them valuable for operations in East Asia during the Cold War. The son of General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, who had conquered Singapore and later been executed for war crimes in the Philippines, found himself working for American intelligence in Vietnam by the 1960s. His intimate knowledge of Japanese military tactics, learned at his father's knee, proved invaluable in training South Vietnamese forces to fight against communist guerrillas who used similar strategies. The ethical implications of these arrangements were staggering. The United States was simultaneously prosecuting Japanese war criminals while recruiting their children as intelligence assets. These young people found themselves in the surreal position of serving the country that had executed their parents, often using knowledge gained from those very parents to advance American strategic interests. The psychological toll was immense. Many of these children developed what psychiatrists would later recognize as complex forms of survivor guilt, feeling simultaneously grateful to America for providing them with opportunities and tormented by the betrayal of their father's memories. One former CIA asset, who agreed to speak with researchers only on condition of anonymity, described the experience as living in a house of mirrors where nothing was real. He had spent 20 years working for American intelligence while maintaining cover as a businessman, all the while knowing that his father had died cursing America as Japan's eternal enemy. Yet for all the moral complexity, these programs also produced some unexpected success stories. Several children of war leaders went on to become prominent American citizens, contributing to fields ranging from technology to medicine to education. They had transformed their inherited burden into a form of redemption, using the opportunities America provided to build lives dedicated to peace and progress. But not all of these American dreams would last. As the Cold War intensified and anti-Asian sentiment periodically flared in American society, some of these carefully constructed new identities would face their greatest tests yet. While some children of Japanese war leaders fled to America, others found themselves confronting an even more complex legacy in Korea, a country that had suffered under Japanese colonial rule for 35 years and harbored deep resentment against the architects of that oppression. The story of the Terauchi family illustrates the brutal ironies that emerged from this history. Count Masatake Terauchi had been one of the most hated figures in Korean history, serving as the country's first Japanese governor-general from 1910 to 1916, and implementing policies that attempted to erase Korean culture entirely. His administration had banned the Korean language in schools, forced Koreans to adopt Japanese names, and brutally suppressed any form of national expression. When Korea was divided after World War II, Terauchi's grandson found himself in the extraordinary position of living in Seoul as a translator for the American military government. The young man had been born in Korea during his grandfather's governorship, but raised in Japan, giving him fluency in both languages that made him valuable to occupation forces who needed to communicate with Korean officials. The situation became surreal when Korean independence leaders, whom his grandfather had once imprisoned, began working alongside him in the new government. Kim Koo, who had spent years in Japanese prisons for organizing resistance activities, found himself in meetings translated by the grandson of the man who had ordered his original arrest. Neither side acknowledged the connection publicly, but the psychological tension was unbearable. The young Terauchi later described feeling as though he were translating conversations between ghosts, facilitating discussions between Koreans planning their free future and Americans who needed Korean cooperation, while carrying the burden of his family's role in destroying that freedom in the first place. The situation became even more complicated when the Korean War began in 1950. Several children of former Japanese colonial administrators found themselves caught between communist North Korean forces who viewed them as symbols of imperialism, and South Korean forces who couldn't decide whether they were potential allies or dangerous reminders of colonial oppression. The daughter of Jiro Minami, who had served as governor-general during some of the harshest years of Japanese rule, experienced this firsthand when North Korean forces occupied Seoul in 1950. Communist soldiers, searching for Japanese collaborators and symbols of the old regime, discovered her living in a small apartment where she had been working as a seamstress. Rather than execute her immediately, the North Korean commander made a decision that revealed the complex psychology of post-colonial revenge. He forced her to tour Korean historical sites that had been destroyed or defiled during Japanese rule, making her translate Korean testimonies about Japanese atrocities into Japanese for a propaganda film that would be shown to prisoners of war. The experience broke her psychologically. She was being forced to confront the full scope of her father's administration's brutality, while simultaneously being used as a propaganda tool by forces that viewed her as the embodiment of Japanese imperialism. When UN forces retook Seoul months later, they found her in a state of complete psychological collapse. But perhaps the most extraordinary case involved the children of Koreans who had served in the Japanese military during World War II. These families faced a unique form of inherited guilt. They were ethnically Korean, but had fought for Japan, making them traitors in the eyes of Korean nationalists and unwelcome in Japan after the war ended. The son of General Hong Sa-ik, who had been one of the highest-ranking Korean officers in the Japanese army, found himself stateless after 1945. Japan refused to recognize his citizenship because of his Korean ethnicity, while Korea refused to accept him because of his father's collaboration with Japanese militarism. He spent nearly 5 years in displaced persons camps, learning that his father had been executed by Korean independence forces in 1946 for war crimes committed while wearing a Japanese uniform. The young man carried both Korean blood and Japanese military traditions, making him unwelcome in either country. His eventual fate illustrated the tragic complexity of post-colonial identity. He emigrated to Paraguay in 1952, becoming part of a small community of ethnically Korean Japanese military veterans who had found refuge in South America. There, isolated from both Korean and Japanese communities, they maintained a unique culture that blended elements of both traditions while belonging fully to neither. These Korean connections also produced some unexpected reconciliations. In the 1960s, as South Korea and Japan began normalizing diplomatic relations, several children of former colonial administrators played quiet but important roles as cultural bridges between the two countries. The grandson of Governor General Terauchi eventually became a professor of Korean history at a Japanese university, dedicating his academic career to documenting the atrocities committed during his grandfather's administration. His scholarship provided some of the most detailed accounts of Japanese colonial policies, written from the unique perspective of someone who had access to family documents and memories that no other researcher possessed. This transformation from inherited guilt to scholarly redemption represented one possible path forward for the children of war leaders. By confronting their families' legacies directly and contributing to historical understanding, they could transform their burden into a form of service. But for every story of reconciliation, there were others that ended in continued tragedy and displacement. The collapse of Imperial Japan created an unexpected opportunity for one of history's most ruthless intelligence services, the Soviet NKVD. As Stalin's agents scoured the ruins of the Japanese Empire for useful assets, they discovered that some of the most valuable intelligence could be obtained not from captured generals or seized documents, but from the children of those generals, young people desperate enough to trade information for survival. The story of what happened to Japanese leaders' children in Soviet hands reveals one of the Cold War's darkest chapters, a tale of manipulation and survival that remained classified for decades. When Soviet forces swept through Manchuria in August 1945, they captured not just Japanese military installations, but entire communities of Japanese settlers, including the families of high-ranking officers who had been stationed in the puppet state of Manchukuo. Among these were children whose fathers had been intimate with Japanese strategic planning, intelligence networks, and military capabilities that the Soviets were eager to understand. The NKVD established what they euphemistically called friendship schools in several Siberian cities, facilities that were officially described as educational institutions for Japanese war orphans, but functioned primarily as intelligence gathering operations. Children as young as 10 were systematically debriefed about their father's work, their family's connections, and anything they might have overheard about Japanese military planning. The process was psychologically devastating. These children, already traumatized by the collapse of everything they had known, found themselves rewarded for betraying their father's memories. Those who provided useful information received better food, warmer clothing, and promises of eventual repatriation to Japan. Those who resisted faced punishments that broke many of them completely. Yuki Ishihara was 13 when Soviet forces captured her family near Harbin. Her father had been a colonel in the Kwantung Army's intelligence division, and she possessed an eidetic memory that allowed her to recall conversations she had overheard years earlier. Soviet interrogators discovered this gift and spent months extracting information about Japanese intelligence operations across China. The girl's testimony helped the Soviets understand Japanese cryptographic methods, identify Japanese agents who might still be operating in China, and piece together the structure of military intelligence networks that had taken Japan decades to build. In exchange, She was promised that her mother would be allowed to join her and that they would both be sent home to Japan within a year. Neither promise was kept. Her mother died in a separate Soviet facility, and Yuki spent the next 12 years in various Soviet institutions, eventually becoming a translator for the GRU, Soviet military intelligence. She would not see Japan again until 1957, by which time she had become so thoroughly Sovietized that she struggled to readjust to Japanese society. The Soviets were particularly interested in children whose fathers had been involved in Unit 731, Japan's biological warfare program in Manchuria. These youngsters possessed knowledge about one of Imperial Japan's most closely guarded secrets, information that Stalin believed could give the Soviet Union a decisive advantage in any future conflict with the United States. The son of a Unit 731 researcher spent 3 years in Soviet custody, during which he was forced to draw detailed diagrams of facilities he had visited with his father, recall conversations about biological agents, and identify other Japanese scientists who had been involved in the program. The information he provided helped Soviet scientists understand Japanese advances in biological warfare, knowledge they would later use in developing their own programs. But the Soviet approach to these children was not purely exploitative. Some genuinely did receive excellent educations in Soviet institutions and went on to build successful careers in the communist system. A few became prominent academics, diplomats, or even party officials, though always under careful surveillance and with their Japanese origins kept secret. The daughter of Admiral Kichisaburo Nomura, who had served as Japan's ambassador to the United States before Pearl Harbor, found herself studying international relations at Moscow State University in the 1950s. Her father's diplomatic background and her own intelligence made her valuable to Soviet foreign policy planners, who needed experts on American-Japanese relations. She eventually became a professor at the Diplomatic Academy in Moscow, spending 30 years training Soviet diplomats, while maintaining the fiction that she was the daughter of Russian refugees who had fled Japan after the 1917 revolution. Her true identity remained hidden even from her closest colleagues, and she lived in constant fear that her Japanese background would be discovered and used against her. The psychological toll of this double life was immense. She later described feeling as though she were living someone else's dreams, successful and respected in Soviet society, but unable to ever acknowledge who she really was or where she had come from. Perhaps most tragically, many of these children lost all connection to their Japanese identity. Years of Soviet education, combined with the constant pressure to deny their backgrounds, created a generation of people who were ethnically Japanese but culturally Soviet, yet never fully accepted in either society. When some were finally allowed to return to Japan in the 1960s as part of diplomatic negotiations, they found themselves as foreign in their homeland as they had been in the Soviet Union. They spoke Japanese with Russian accents, thought in Marxist-Leninist terms that made no sense to their relatives, and carried Soviet habits and mannerisms that marked them as outsiders. The full scope of Soviet operations targeting the children of Japanese war leaders would not become clear until the 1990s, when declassified KGB files revealed the systematic nature of these programs and their long-term strategic objectives. By the 1960s, a remarkable transformation was taking place. The children who had once fled their father's legacies and terror were beginning to emerge from the shadows, and some were choosing paths that would have been unimaginable 20 years earlier. Rather than continuing to hide from their inherited burden, they began to transform it into something entirely new. This shift reflected broader changes in Japanese society as the country experienced its economic miracle and began to grapple more openly with its wartime past. But for the children of war leaders, this reckoning was deeply personal, a chance to redefine not just how the world saw them, but how they saw themselves. The most dramatic transformation belonged to Hideki Tojo Jr., the eldest son of Japan's wartime prime minister. After spending the late 1940s and 1950s living under an assumed name and working as a clerk in Osaka, the younger Tojo made an extraordinary decision in 1962. He would reclaim his family name and enter politics. The announcement sent shockwaves through Japanese society. Here was the son of the man most associated with Japan's militarist past, proposing to seek public office in a country that had constitutionally renounced war. Critics accused him of trying to rehabilitate his father's legacy, while supporters saw him as representing a new generation that could help Japan fully confront its history. Tojo Jr.'s political platform was unlike anything Japan had seen. Rather than defending his father's actions or attempting to minimize their consequences, he built his campaign around the concept of inherited responsibility, the idea that while he bore no guilt for his father's decisions, he had a special obligation to work for peace and reconciliation. His first campaign speech, delivered to a crowd that included several former prisoners of war, was a masterpiece of moral complexity. He spoke about growing up in the shadow of his father's legacy, about the shame and confusion he had experienced, and about his determination to use that burden as motivation for building a more peaceful world. The speech resonated with Japanese voters, who were themselves struggling to understand their country's wartime role. Here was someone who embodied their national dilemma: how to honor family and tradition, while rejecting the actions those traditions had produced. Tojo Jr. won his election and would serve in the Diet for over 2 decades, becoming one of Japan's most prominent peace activists. Other children of war leaders chose different forms of transformation. The daughter of General Iwane Matsui, who had been executed for his role in the Nanjing massacre, became a Buddhist nun and dedicated her life to caring for Chinese war refugees who had fled to Japan during the Civil War period. Her temple in Kyoto became an unofficial center for reconciliation between Chinese and Japanese communities, hosting ceremonies that honored victims of wartime violence while teaching both populations about the shared Buddhist traditions that transcended national boundaries. She never publicly discussed her father's identity, but those who knew her background understood that her devotion to peace was a form of personal atonement. The transformation was not limited to those who chose public service. The grandson of Admiral Yamamoto became a prominent marine biologist, dedicating his career to studying the coral reefs that had been damaged by naval battles across the Pacific. His research contributed to international conservation efforts that brought together scientists from former enemy nations to protect ocean ecosystems. In interviews late in his life, he would describe swimming through underwater battlefields where his grandfather's planes had fought American forces, collecting data that helped restore damaged coral communities. The work allowed him to contribute to healing the very waters where his family's legacy had been written in violence. Perhaps most remarkably, several children of war leaders became pioneers in international reconciliation efforts. They possessed unique credentials for this work. Their family backgrounds gave them credibility with conservative Japanese audiences who might dismiss peace activists as naive, while their personal rejection of militarism made them acceptable to foreign communities that had suffered under Japanese occupation. The son of Foreign Minister Matsuoka became a translator for the United Nations, spending his career facilitating diplomatic conversations between nations that his father had helped drive to war. He worked on peace negotiations in Korea, Vietnam, and Cambodia, using language skills inherited from his diplomatic family to build bridges between former enemies. These transformation stories reveal how inherited trauma could become a source of unexpected strength. Rather than being crushed by their family legacies, these individuals found ways to metabolize their burden into positive action. They became living proof that cycles of violence and hatred could be broken. The children need not be prisoners of their parents' choices, but the process was never simple or complete. Even the most successful transformations carried psychological costs that lasted lifetimes. Many of these individuals struggled with depression, anxiety, and complex forms of survivor guilt. They had escaped their inherited burden by transforming it, but transformation required constant vigilance and emotional labor that never fully ended. The children who chose public transformation also faced ongoing scrutiny and criticism. Every speech, every policy position, every public appearance was analyzed for signs that they were secretly trying to rehabilitate their father's legacies. They lived under a microscope that made normal political or professional careers impossible. Yet their efforts produced tangible results. By the 1970s, Japan's approach to its wartime history had begun to shift, partly due to the influence of these transformed children of war leaders, who provided models for how individuals and nations could confront difficult pasts while building different futures. Their stories would inspire a new generation of Japanese peace activists and international reconciliation workers, demonstrating that even the most shameful legacies could become sources of moral authority if approached with sufficient courage and commitment to change. Behind the remarkable stories of transformation and survival lay a darker truth: the profound psychological costs of carrying their inherited burden. The first comprehensive study of their mental health in the 1980s revealed a population marked by extraordinarily high rates of anxiety, depression, and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Akiko Hashimoto described their condition as moral injury compounded by inherited guilt. Unlike typical trauma survivors, these individuals could not process their experiences without simultaneously confronting their family's roles in creating similar trauma for others. The daughter of Colonel Tsuji Masanobu exemplified this psychology. She spent 40 years as a pediatric nurse, dedicating her life to caring for children while never revealing her family background. But her work constantly triggered flashbacks while reminding her of the children her father's actions had orphaned across Asia. The son of General Yamashita developed what he called his performance self, a carefully constructed public identity that bore no resemblance to his internal experience of chronic insomnia and recurring nightmares about his father's execution. The isolation was perhaps most difficult. While other trauma survivors could find support groups, the children of war leaders were virtually unique. They could not relate to ordinary war survivors, who viewed them with suspicion, nor connect with other victims of inherited trauma. Many never found effective treatment because their experiences were so unique that most mental health professionals had no framework for understanding them. Yet their experiences provided crucial insights into one of humanity's most fundamental questions: how do we take responsibility for the past without being destroyed by it? As the children of Japan's war leaders entered their final decades, Emperor Hirohito's death in 1989 triggered a national conversation about Japan's wartime past. The 1990s brought revelations as international pressure and declassified documents created an environment where long-hidden truths could no longer remain buried. Hideki Tojo Jr. made a stunning decision at a 1993 reconciliation conference in Tokyo. He publicly apologized not just for his father's actions, but for hiding his identity for decades. The unprecedented apology sparked national debate about inherited responsibility, but gave other aging survivors permission to finally tell their stories. Remarkable testimonies emerged. The daughter of General Matsui, who had spent 50 years as a Buddhist nun, revealed her identity in 1995 and spoke about her father's role in the Nanjing massacre. Her testimony was powerful because she combined moral authority with intimate knowledge of how ordinary people could become complicit in evil. Others revealed extensive networks that had helped war leaders' families escape justice, showing how complicit Japanese society had been. Some described serving foreign intelligence agencies, revealing how the Cold War had complicated narratives about justice. The granddaughter of Admiral Yamamoto had become a librarian in rural Hokkaido, spending 40 years quietly documenting war history while never revealing her connection to Pearl Harbor's architect. Their stories began influencing how Japan approached its wartime history, contributing to educational changes and diplomatic evolution. Today, fewer than a dozen children of Japan's major war leaders remain alive, the last living links to this extraordinary chapter in human resilience. Today, as we reach the conclusion of this extraordinary chapter in human history, fewer than a dozen children of Japan's major war leaders remain alive. They are now in their 80s and 90s, the last living links to one of the 20th century's most traumatic periods and its aftermath. Their collective story reveals truths that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of post-war Japan. They demonstrate that children need not be prisoners of their parents' choices, that inherited shame can be transformed into moral authority, and that even the most difficult legacies can become sources of wisdom and compassion. Some found redemption through public service and peace activism, others through quiet lives of private atonement, still others through exile and reinvention in foreign countries, a few through scholarship and education that helped their nation confront its difficult past. Each path required extraordinary courage and carried profound psychological costs, but together they created a remarkable testament to human resilience and the possibility of breaking cycles of violence and hatred. Their experiences also provided crucial insights into the nature of historical trauma and its transmission across generations. They showed how the children of perpetrators face unique psychological challenges that require different approaches from those developed for the children of victims. Their struggles contributed to important advances in understanding inherited guilt, moral injury, and the complex processes through which societies come to terms with difficult pasts. If you enjoyed this video, Please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.